Our next speaker is Yara Notea. Yara recently defended her PhD at King's College London. Her research examines popular American girls' fiction and its cultural and political functions in 20th century United States. Yara, the floor is yours.
Hi everyone. I usually don't use a PowerPoint, so this is going to be an adventure. Thanks so much for being here today and for having me here today in this very undepressing conference that's been so fun. I hope that my talk sort of continues in that in that vein. I want to start just by saying that this work is based on one of my PhD chapters that I'm now reworking into an article, so any feedback on how it works or maybe doesn't would be greatly appreciated. Okay, here goes. There's an established narrative among critics about girls' fiction in what is generally referred to as the post-war period, but in fact spans the war years as well, roughly from 1940 to the late 1960s. This is it. In 1942, Maureen Daly's 17th Summer was published and quickly became wildly successful. The novel's groundbreaking popularity inspired the birth of a new popular genre for teenage girls, known as the junior novel, the high school romance, commodity tales, or mall shop novels, all different names for the same thing. The emergence of this genre reflected the emergence of youth as a distinct market category following the Great Depression, the economic boom of the war, the establishment of high school culture, as well as the post-World War II conservative backlash. These girls' books are understood to take their cue from 17th Summer's form and content, its formula, if you will, and are typically considered formulaic, conservative, and detached from the contemporary social reality of their period. Their protagonists are stock characters, solely interested in popularity, clothes, and boys, supposedly, yes? 2 decades later, in the climate of the 60s, the successful mid-century girls' books were deemed stereotypical, sexist, racist, classist, and simply irrelevant by a new generation of readers, librarians, critics, and YA realist novelists. By the late 70s, most junior novels, with the exception of those penned by otherwise well-known authors such as Beverly Cleary, completely disappeared from the bookshelves, dooming 17th Summer to oblivion. And this is despite the fact that most critics today claim that 17th Summer was sort of the first YA book, right? There are others that get granted that title, but generally it's accepted that it's 17th Summer, so a lot of its formal features lived on. Yet, there are holes in the seemingly straightforward analysis of the genre as a whole, and of Daly's novel, the focus of my talk today, in particular. Originally published for adults, 17th Summer was received very well by critics and readers of all ages during the war, until it came to be seen as a disdained girls' book in the post-war period. It's considered a history-making book, since its formal registers, as I just said, became defining features of not only girls' fiction, but YA literature as a whole. How is 17th Summer, then, so highly influential and yet so invisible to readers today? Most people don't know it. I don't know if you did. I could do a show of hands, probably maybe one would go up. How was it both an adult book of high literary value and the prototype of one of the most debased popular literary forms, the vapid story of a boy-crazy teenage girl? And I'll fight hard on this one, how could anyone reading 17th Summer find it simple, shallow, and formulaic? And this is not to say that I have any problem with simple, shallow, and formulaic books. I spent a good chunk of the past 5 years studying them with great joy and interest, but in this case, the categorization just doesn't hold. So in this talk, I try and answer these questions. I want to suggest that for a short span of time, between 1942 and 1945, Daly's novels served as a popular mediation of the national anxieties surrounding World War II, relying on the fact that a 17-year-old girl in love could stand in for youth and the American way of life. The book does this by constructing protagonist Angie Morrow as a universal adolescent subject, capable of symbolizing lauded American values and ideologies. Framed in these radical terms, it becomes no surprise that after the war, as the realities of post-war backlash hit, 17th Summer had to be reframed as a silly girls' romance, soon to be forgotten. 17th Summer relays the story of 17-year-old Angie and her summer after high school graduation, in which she falls in love and in lust for the first time with a boy named Jack. Though Jack proposes at the end of the summer, the two separate. Angie goes away to college, and Jack prepares to move to Oklahoma with his family. So there's no marriage plot here. The book is set sometime in the amorphous mid-century. Published in the spring of 1942, it makes no mention of World War II, though there are residual references to the Depression. Its setting is the real town of Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, very random, but it exists, Angie's mostly middle-class, very white hometown. Despite its generically conventional scope and plot, 17th Summer transcends the formula it helped establish. This is due in large part to Daly subtly making the narrator, the setting, and the scope of the book its true subject. As much as 17th Summer is a story about first love, that story provides the vehicle through which the book explores subjectivity, experience, and the beauty and ephemerality of youth and life, as incarnated in teen culture in mid-century, small-town, white, middle-class America. How did it become so successful then? A crucial aspect of the book's early reception was its categorization as an authentic depiction of mid-century American youth. A review of the book in the New York Times compliments its, quote, poignant authenticity that rings true and sweet and fresh and sound so that one forgets how often the same story had been told before. And one from the LA Times asserts that the book offers, quote, a gentle insight into the sensitivities, the transient sorrows of adolescence. Amanda Allen's study of letters from both male soldiers on the front and teenage girls to Daly throughout the war shows they similarly emphasize the truthfulness of her depiction. Throughout the war, then, Angie's story was perceived as a portrayal of the supposedly universal essence of American adolescence. The construction of both Angie and her story as universal relies on the protagonist's characterization through the novel's narration as a full subject. Much of the power of Angie's tale, I want to suggest, stems from the fact that it centers on a 17-year-old girl in love and treats her, her story, her experience, her mind, with the utmost respect. Narrated in the first person, there are two Angies present in the novel, narrator Angie and protagonist Angie. But 17th Summer doesn't read as a retrospective rumination by an older Angie on what being young and in love is like. Daly was herself only 21 when the novel was published, right? Rather, narrator Angie offers intimate, largely uncensored access to her 17-year-old mind and remains focused on and immersed in protagonist Angie, the younger self, her experiences, her physical, emotional, and cognitive responses to events and to her own swirling thoughts. Narrator Angie's perspective is still present, but she only offers reflections that helpfully contextualize, summarize, or generalize, enhancing our understanding of protagonist Angie's immediate, concrete experience and mindset. What narrator Angie doesn't do, and this is crucial, is fall into what are now narratorial tropes of junior novels and girls' fiction, and much of girls' romance fiction, general fiction, women's romance, chick lit. Narrator Angie doesn't judge her younger self for her thoughts or feelings that summer. She doesn't linger on or criticize gaps in her own understanding. She doesn't accept and internalize others' opinion of herself, and she doesn't fall into formulaic traps that would mark her as solely an object of male desire. And sexuality is a big deal here, and I don't have time to go into it, but if anyone's interested, I'm happy to chat about all of this. It's this utter lack of undermining that positions Angie in such stark contrast to so many other heroines of girls' fiction. And it's what constructs her as a subject, not an object, marking her as capable of holding a national symbolic function during the war. I want to demonstrate some of the aspects of this characterization by looking at one example of Angie's meditations on her own experience of time, of waiting by the phone for Jack to call. Narrator Angie opens the section saying, somehow, when the telephone doesn't ring, it seems even more noisily present than if it is constantly jiggling. The seriousness of Angie's tone and the confidence with which she offers this nugget of universal wisdom indicates that narrator Angie's retroactive perspective here, right? This is Angie who has lived through waiting for the phone more than once, and she can now comment on the experience as a whole. If the narration had stopped there, narrator Angie's perspective would have taken over protagonist Angie's story, marking it not as a personal experience, but as an empty cliche, something along the lines of like, oh, waiting by the phone is just awful. Instead, the narration goes into an almost 3-page long report of the endless wait. Here's a snippet. As each day went by, it became more evident that he didn't mean to call. Every time I went into the dining room, I could feel the phone on the corner table behind my back, almost as if it were someone staring at me. If it rang while I was upstairs, I waited, breathless, to hear the mumbled conversation, praying that footsteps would come to the stair banister to call up, "For you, Angie." When I was washing my face in the bathroom, I left the door open just a little so I could hear its ring over the noise of the water from the faucet. and when I was weeding in the garden between the vegetable rows, my ears were strained with conscious alertness to catch any noise from the house. And as the end of the week drew near, each ring made that lump in my throat harder and heavier. Here, the narration breaks down why narrator Angie says at the start that the phone is noisier in its silence than in its ringing. Assuming protagonist Angie's perspective, the immediate and unpretty reality of waiting for the phone to ring takes shape. It's not an abstract idea, but a constant cycle of expectation and disappointment, of hope and self-doubt that takes over one's thoughts, her senses, and haunts her days. The protagonist Angie will later learn that the reason Jack didn't call was because she went on a date with fast boy Tony. Narrator Angie doesn't use her younger self's gap in reading the situation against her. She doesn't frame it as her fault or mock Angie for her wretched state. Instead, 17th Summer treats Angie's lack of understanding as representative of her youthful innocence, and it doesn't minimize her experience at any point. By the end of this section, Angie painfully reflects on the impact of days of waiting on her. And as each day changed into evening and Margaret, Angie's sister, came home from work full of talk about art in the store, and the setting sun slid long shadows onto the lawn, a queer, tired feeling crept over me and through me until even my hands went limp. I didn't even feel like a girl anymore, and all my thoughts turned into little prayers which I meant so much that it made me ache all over. Just once, I kept saying. Let him call just once. While the statement, I didn't even feel like a girl anymore, reads as a narrator Angie retrospective comment, Daly embeds it within a paragraph that otherwise maintains protagonist Angie's perspective. The breathless description of evening coming down and of her repetitive thoughts position us alongside Angie in the moment, exhausted and disappointed and hopeful all at once, and significantly, aware that this is how she's feeling and why. Thus, the section fleshes out the sensorial, emotional, and cognitive experience of waiting for the phone to ring. The detail, the awareness, and the honesty of Angie's account, coupled with her generalizing comment establishing that this is what waiting by the phone is always like, constructs her idiosyncratic individual experience as universal. It becomes a narrative about waiting, expecting, hoping, and despairing. It doesn't really matter for what. And I find this example is especially useful precisely because it draws on an experience that supposedly is gendered, right? Boys in romance novels, but also in real life through most of the 20th century, I hear it's not that way today anymore, don't have to wait by the phone for a girl to call. Although the gendered power dynamics are definitely present throughout this scene, 17th Summer's zoomed-in deconstruction of the experience transforms the girl waiting by the phone trope into the non-gendered universal experience of waiting so hard that one ceases to feel like a person so much as a vehicle for expectation. The experience of waiting, of course, carries extra meaning in wartime. During World War II, this entailed not only the dreadful expectation of news from the front. Rather, much like youth, the war itself came to be experienced as an in-between, halted state. After Pearl Harbor, a new phrase came into being, for the duration. George Hutchinson explains that both on the war front and the home front, quote, the war years were a period of holding one's imaginative breath, of waiting, on the other hand, or on the other, of undergoing trauma so difficult to absorb out of time and out of mind. Hutchinson suggests that in light of this new temporality, the literature of the period demonstrates, quote, an attempt to capture the changing phenomenology of time. Daly's construction of time, not only in this scene, but this scene is emblematic of the novel's engagement with time as a whole, mediates wartime's attempts to reckon with new forms of temporality. Right? This is, in many senses, a book about time. It's structured around the hours and the days and the months of summer, so much that I could actually plot Angie's summer on a calendar. She's so detailed with 9 a.m. I did this, at 12 p.m. we did this, 2 days later that happened. And she's also occupied with the iterative cycles of life in what is conceived as the all-American locale, the small town. Angie celebrates the natural joys of summer as it unfolds, as well as the American way of life, marking it as seemingly endless at a time in which it is conceived as under threat. At the same time, the novel presents Angie's maturation as the product of her developing understanding and acceptance of time's passage, of the ephemerality of experience and the need to both immerse oneself in the moment and recognize the moment's transience. By the final passage of the novel, as she watches Fond du Lac rush past the train window on her way to college in Chicago, Angie remarks, and I saw it all glide past me, lopped off by fence posts, and I felt myself ache inside with a quiet sadness. And now I knew suddenly that it could come and come forever, slipping by in the breath of a moment, and yet never again would there be anything quite as wonderful as that 17th summer. Angie's summer culminates then not in a happily ever after with Jack, but with the newfound awareness that her childhood, represented by this summer, is over. She has garnered a new understanding of herself and of time. Angie's summers will never be quite as wonderful because she spent this season learning that single moments will keep slipping by in the breath of a moment, and thus must be experienced fully and remembered. Read in the context of the war, Angie's awareness of time's passage and the ephemerality of youth, specifically, thus echoes the realities of wartime demands from adolescence and the conceptualization of war itself as a temporary state. 17th Summer's popularity and success mirror this temporariness. By 1946, the book was no longer a bestseller about the universal experience of youth in the United States, but a silly girl's book about romance. I want to suggest that this shift in the novel's reception is due to the fact that Angie could only be accepted as a universal adolescent subject for the duration of the war. This is because between 1941 and 1945, American women came to stand in for American values and public roles, perceived as supposedly universal, but previously gendered masculine, that were denied them both before and after the war. From the earliest stages of the war, women were asked to enlist in and support the war effort in ways that reconceptualized their traditional roles in American society. They were implored to rally and ration and economize, called to work outside the home, replacing men who left for the war front in factories, service sector jobs, agricultural work. They were invited to join the army, not only as nurses, but as soldiers in the Women's Army Corps. And they were asked to send their husbands and boyfriends sexually implicit photographs to ease their days away from home. These demands relied on and created a new perception of American women's capabilities and their position in American society. This was obviously, unsurprisingly, met with resistance and anxiety, leading to contradictory expectations and demands. Even as they were asked to take on supposedly masculine roles and to embody masculine values, women were expected to be, quote, motivated by feminine ambitions, the desire to help win the war so their men could return quickly and their children could grow up in a safe world. These contradictions were supposedly justified by the promise, or the threat, that the changes to women's lives were, as everything else was during the war, temporary. This is the environment into which 17th Summer was published. During the war, with women called on to become breadwinners and protectors of the home, Angie could take on the representative power of universal youth previously attached to male characters such as Huck Finn. She could embody adolescence in American small-town life, just as both came under threat from the war. But as the war ended and the post-war backlash against women hit, and women were set back in their rightful place, the book's localized assertion of girl as universal could no longer be sustained. Angie's story was stripped of its power, relegated as a romance girls' book and nothing more. Key elements of the form daly created were preserved and repurposed, while the most startling aspects were either forgotten entirely or associated with a YA realism understood to be a world away from 17th Summer's supposedly syrupy story. Finally, I want to emphasize that, paradoxically perhaps, 17th Summer's success during the war hinges on the fact that it centers on an adolescent girl. Due to the reality of the draft looming over adolescent teenage boys, a version of 17th Summer featuring a 17-year-old hero falling in love and reckoning with maturation in a mid-century war-free setting would have appeared escapist and detached, rather than utterly enchanting, as one reviewer called Angie's tale. Angie's age and gender position her in a unique liminal space beyond the obliviousness of childhood, at a period when ruminating on the meaning of life, relationships, and time are to be expected. But they also catch her one moment before the demands of marriage and motherhood kick in, making any claim to individual subjectivity as the base for the unraveling of a universal human experience impossible. At this specific point in American history, being a girl opened up more symbolic and mediating possibilities for Angie than if she were a boy destined for the barracks. Alas, this, like the book's success, could be nothing but temporary. Thank you.